The Technology History Podcast. Exciting stories about the development of technology by Christian Steinbach. Hi everybody, and welcome to the third episode in English of my Technology History Podcast about the concept and the development of the space shuttle. Today we travel into space and back to the 1970s. I'll tell you how American manned space travel continued after the flights of the Apollo program, which primarily took the Americans to the moon. An exhibit that I was able to view last early summer on a decommissioned aircraft carrier in New York played an important role here. This was a Space Shuttle Enterprise, which never flew into space itself, but still enjoys the reputation of being the first space shuttle ever at the American Space Agency NASA. But first of all, let's look at the situation around 1970. In the meantime, the major goal that America was striving for in the 1960s had been achieved. It had succeeded in bringing people to the moon for the first time and returning them safely. However, the euphoria subsided surprisingly quickly. By the third attempt to reach the moon, the public was hardly interested in the space adventure. That only changed when an oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon and NASA was forced to bring the 3 astronauts back to Earth in a media-wide campaign lasting several days. One of them, Fred Hayes, will meet us again later in connection with the Enterprise mentioned at the beginning. After what NASA later called a successful failure, they landed on the moon 4 more times. During the period of these missions between 1971 and 72, however, the focus of public interest finally shifted away from space travel, so that 3 other originally planned lunar missions, for which some of the hardware had already been produced, were cancelled. Although the remains of the Apollo program were cleverly recycled in the form of the Skylab space station and a joint mission with the Soviet Union, it became apparent at the beginning of the 1970s that the concept of future American space travel would look fundamentally different. When the first flight to the moon was aimed for in the 1960s in an exciting race with the Soviet Union, money hardly played a role. With an adventurous budget, the main aim was to develop, test and deploy the necessary technology as quickly as possible. It didn't matter that the complex and expensively produced spacecraft could only be used once. It was more time efficient to simply build the same spaceship again instead of thinking about possible reusable technology. As already mentioned, this changed suddenly in the early 1970s when the national goal of flight to the moon was achieved and American society and its politicians turned back to earthly issues. In these not easy times for NASA, it was essential to find a concept that, on the one hand, had a plausible raison d'être and also took into account the new focus on economic efficiency. The military finally showed interest in a cost-effective way to transport large and heavy military payloads, such as spy satellites, into low Earth orbits. In addition, the possibility of commercial space travel was already being considered, for example, by transporting satellites for a fee. Against this background, the Space Shuttle program was finally started in 1972. The concept broke with many traditions of manned space travel that had been common up to that point. It envisaged 3 different components. The actual space transporter, which resembles an airplane, should be able to start with the help of 2 booster rockets and an additional fuel tank and then spend several days in space. It should then land like a glider. They also wanted to salvage and reuse the booster rockets. The only device lost would then be the comparatively inexpensive external fuel tank. North American Rockwell, which now belongs to Boeing, was awarded the contract to build the actual space shuttle, or simply shuttle for short. Even if the technical requirements appear small compared to flights to the moon, major problems arose again and again during the development phase, which were associated with high additional costs and time delays. A major challenge was the development of heat protection. In previous space capsules, the problem was solved in the form of a heat shield, which only had to cover a comparatively small area and was not intended to be reused. Ultimately, they decided on tiles made of a silicon-oxygen compound, which, however, had to be glued individually to the space shuttle in a laborious process. And the glue also caused a major headache for the engineers. After the first version proved to be completely unsuitable, all tiles had to be removed and re-glued before the first space shuttle flight into space. And tiles were lost again and again during space flights. But we are not there yet. First of all, the Enterprise, which I visited last year, was completed in 1976. This was intended as a prototype for a variety of tests, which is why unimportant systems were not installed. When the Enterprise was presented to the public on September 17, 1976, there were, how could it be otherwise, some actors from the television series Star Trek on site. Above all, it was initially about testing the shuttle's ability to fly when returning from space. For this purpose, the Enterprise was mounted on a modified Boeing 747, also known as a jumbo jet, carried into the air and then decoupled. The test pilots then had to land it like a glider. One of them was astronaut Fred Hayes, who almost died during Apollo 13's failed lunar flight. The landing attempts went without any major problems. After the approach tests, the Enterprise was used for vibration tests to check the durability of the structure. For this purpose, it was connected for the first time to an external tank and two booster rockets. The launch pad and various procedures, such as refueling, were then tested with it in Cape Canaveral. Originally, it was planned to upgrade the Enterprise to spaceflight capability, but this was not done due to modifications that have since been made. Instead, it was used for a few more tests and sent on a promotional tour, where it was even seen at Cologne-Bonn Airport in Germany in 1983. It finally ended up in New York in 2012, where it can be visited as a museum piece. The Columbia was completed in 1979 as the first space shuttle to actually fly into space. The first flight was originally supposed to take place in 1978. The many technical problems that had to be solved in the course of development meant that it actually wasn't until April 1981. At this point, however, it should be remembered that developments in the 1970s were different than they are today. At that time, engineers only had very simple computer technology at their disposal. Many concepts were created on paper with the help of a slide rule. And another aspect could also have contributed to the numerous launch postponements. Until this point, all rocket systems that took people into space were first tested unmanned. Fully automated flight capability was not planned for the space shuttle. So two astronauts, a commander and a pilot, had to be on board for the first test launch. And another point related to the topic of safety. In all previous manned launches, rescue systems were in place in case the rocket failed during takeoff. In the flights of the Mercury and Apollo spacecraft, in this case, a rescue rocket would have torn the capsule with the astronaut or astronauts on board away from the rocket so that it could have landed on parachutes. During the Gemini spaceflights, the astronauts sat in ejection seats similar to those in fighter planes. However, there were no such systems in the space shuttle system. And an aircraft like spacecraft with such complex heat protection had never returned to Earth from space. You have to keep all of this in mind if you try to at least begin to understand what must have been going on in the minds of the two astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen and the engineers responsible before the Columbia took off for the first time from the launch pad at Cape Canaveral in Florida on April 12, 1981. I'll report on the first flights of the Space Shuttle into space and the program's first major setback next week. With this, I conclude the third episode of the Technology History podcast about the concept and development of the Space Shuttle. If you enjoy the podcast, I would be very happy about a subscription. And maybe you know someone who is also interested in this topic and to whom you would like to recommend my podcast. Finally, my thanks go to Walk In Music from Pixabay, whose song I was allowed to incorporate into the intro. Thank you for your interest and see you next time on the Technology History Podcast.